The internet podcast Every Frame a Pause reviews films, video games, TV, and YouTube content in a long-form audio format. As the name implies, the podcast has a uniquely incremental approach, breaking media down to the individual sentence or shot in order to provide the most thorough analysis possible. EFAP focuses mainly on the internal consistency of a given work, which they claim it is possible to evaluate objectively. This method is somewhat controversial, and EFAP tends to apply it to works that are generally bad by this criteria. This application generally happens in a vacuum, as the hosts spend upwards of 10 hours picking over every detail, picking out every flaw. In such a scenario, the outcome is gruesomely delightful, and thousands tune in each week to watch awful content get vivisected frame by frame. However, what happens when these guardrails get removed? Instead of bad, the content is mediocre or even good. Instead of a closed studio with all that time to think and test ideas, what if there were an opposing voice present? Thankfully, we don't have to speculate on this, since every so often EFAP will have live debates, and the most recent debate was enlightening. This is a comprehensive breakdown of EFAP number 139, the Winter Soldier versus Far From Home debate. This video series will address the meta-level issues with the debate, attempt to raise some points that neither side presented, and counter a few of the worst arguments along the way. I'm trying to get into the gritty details of how the members of this show think, analyze, and argue. This first video will touch on the concept of objective analysis as EFAP describes it, and then as EFAP applies it. The idea of objective analysis is simple. Unless there is an agreed universal standard, debating the quality of media is pointless. Each side can employ whatever lens they find most beneficial, and there is no logical recourse against opinion. You can't argue that someone else felt the wrong way. EFAP tends to employ the standard of internal consistency as the most important objective. This analysis involves questions like, does the work contradict itself? If so, how often and how seriously? This seems fairly simple on the surface, but even slight interrogation reveals there's more at play here. First, what is contradiction? If a character has red hair in one scene and blue hair in another, is that an objective flaw? The crew realized this issue early on in the debate, and we get this statement from Fringy. Quote, "Is it a clear contradiction? That's the important part. Contradiction is an impossibility." End quote. This is a good enough explanation, but ultimately a flawed one. It will be discussed at length in a later video. Second, the question of how frequent and serious the contradictions are. Frequency is simple to measure and part of the reason for the podcast's format. But how does one objectively evaluate the seriousness of a contradiction? That's the trouble of it. You can't. I know that's a bold statement, but bear with me. Let's say a character falls off a roof and survives a fall they shouldn't have, allowing them to save the day. How could one evaluate the seriousness of this depends on the following. 1. How unlikely their survival seemed. 2. How unreasonable this was in context. And 3. How much of it affects the plot. Uh-oh. Our problem is compounding. We had one question to answer objectively, but it's split into 3 more, and they're starting to sound a little subjective. So EFAP's method, in theory, works by examining serious contradictions in the work. It seems like it might be a struggle to evaluate seriousness objectively, but what about contradiction? That can surely be objective, right? Let's look at an example from the debate. During the discussion of the Fury assassination scene, Mahler and Fringy repeatedly criticized the Winter Soldier's approach. They frame the issue as a contradiction. The movie establishes that the Winter Soldier is a great assassin, but he makes stupid decisions in this scene. A great assassin wouldn't make stupid decisions, therefore contradiction. That's the case. So, number 1, this fails the impossibility test. To claim the Winter Soldier would never, ever make these decisions would at minimum require full knowledge of everything he was briefed on, observed, or expected. Even competent people will make bad decisions given poor or limited information. The film does not give enough information to evaluate Bucky's choices in this depth. This is technically a point against EFAP's complaint, but I think it's more important as an example of how ridiculous the standard of impossibility is. Number 2, look at the contradiction more closely. Note the phrase, stupid decisions. That is a purely subjective phrase if I've ever seen one. This diagnosis is based on the EFAP cast's personal opinions of how an assassin should act, what precautions they should take, what they should and shouldn't know, etc. Note that none of that is established in the movie. The character is not contradicting their own fictional representation, they are contradicting the cast's idea of how that character should act. Whether that idea is actually realistic will be discussed in a future video. So, our first live example, they don't and can't prove contradiction, and the complaint is based on a subjective metric. It all boils down to, I don't think a master assassin would do that. Either the EFAP method cannot address this scene, or the hosts have failed to apply it. Maybe this all seems a bit silly, like I'm reading too much into it. You might be saying to yourself, well, duh, nothing is perfectly objective. Or, wow, you're taking this a bit far. I've wrestled with those questions for a while, trying to figure out why I really needed to make this video. I've settled on a couple of answers. Number 1, EFAP takes this method seriously and presents it as an alternative to foolish, subjective discussion. On many episodes, someone says something like, if we were having a talk about a movie and all you had to say was that you liked it, then we don't have anything else to talk about. And then contrasts that with an objective analysis of the writing and consistency. They stick to their method. I believe this method needs far more scrutiny than the EFAP crew seems interested in applying to it. Hence this video. Number 2, EFAP takes the results of this method seriously. I personally thought the EFAP 139 debate was obviously a garbage fire, which made this video seem redundant. After all, who needs some guy on YouTube to tell them that shit smells? However, on a recent episode of EFAP, the conversation turned to Winter Soldier, and Fringy referred to the debate, saying that they had covered the topic, the movie was bad, and the issue was done. This is a clear endorsement of the debate's outcome and the methods used to achieve it. I believe the EFAP method produces poor results, and I will contest those results. Hence, this video. So, to recap, we've discussed the EFAP method of objective analysis, the issues with claiming objectivity, an example of the method in practice, and the reasons for making this video. Next time, we'll discuss fact, fiction, and EFAP's relationship with them.